I'm grateful to the organizers, particularly Nicholas, for inviting me here, as well as to Gerhard and Wolfgang and Heiko for the arrangements. I greatly appreciate it, and the talks so far have been interesting. I fear that that string of success may quickly come to an end, though, with this. Here are two skulls, which at least the one on the left you're quite familiar with, the Georgian female that Blumenbach illustrates, and she is iconic of a certain kind of evaluation, namely a very symmetrical skull according to Blumenbach, a very beautiful skull, and presumably the people, as Null indicated last night, the people whose skull this represents were also quite beautiful. The one on the right, however, is Schiller's skull, as represented by Carl Gustav Carus, and it too has aesthetic features, but also there are certain other measurements that Carus took of that skull to indicate that it had reached a kind of high point, both of intellectual ability and aesthetic ability. The measurement of skulls was used, of course, in this period for scaling human races and finding distinctions among them. One of the kinds of distinctions that was sought for is something that is going to distinguish us from the apes. So there was some suspicion because of ape-like, well, apes and in their relation, their anatomical relation to human beings, that we might have some relationship to the apes. Comper, for example, in a lecture to art students, tried to find some distinctive differences between human beings and apes, as well as a difference among human beings, so that they could be properly represented in paintings. And he invented, as it were, the facial angle. And the apes have the angle of the ape face from the chin to the most prominent part of the forehead is of a lesser angle, so it's between 45 and 50 degrees, according to Comper. The Asian face, as well as the Negro face, has a facial angle generally about 70 degrees. The European, 80 to 90 degrees. He also notes that the Apollo Belvedere has a facial angle of actually 110 degrees, which is not very aesthetically pleasing, and we would say the Apollo Belvedere has a weak chin. He was also interested in what distinguishes human beings from the lower creatures. One of the identifying marks was the Zwischenkiefer, the os intermaxillarius, which you see illustrated here. Researchers in this period were looking for something stamped into anatomy that would distinguish human beings from other creatures, and the os intermaxillarius was one of them. Comper thought only animals had that particular skull bone. He got into a kind of fight with Goethe because Goethe thought that human beings also had such a bone in their skulls, which showed the unity of all of nature. There were other, of course, representatives of this effort to scale human beings. This is a table taken from Samuel Morton, who was a Philadelphia physician. He was interested in Indian groups, but as well as the differences among other of the groups that Blumenbach had identified. And he took to measuring those skulls by putting seeds of peppercorn into the skulls and then measuring the volume of those seeds to see on average what the capacity of those skulls happened to be, and he thought they could be arranged in the way you see. So Caucasian skulls, for the most part, had a capacity of 87 cubic inches, all the way down to the Ethiopian with 78 cubic inches. These he represented as distinct species, so that there was no, these were individual species. He was not of Blumenbach's persuasion that all the varieties of mankind were varieties of one species. Well, I think there are several reasons that have been suggested by the other talks for interest in human differences. Of course, the great travel that took place during this period, Captain Cook's 3 voyages to the South Pacific, introduced Europeans to other groups of individuals. So the interest in racial, what we would say racial differences, was keen up to this time. Also, since there was a suspicion that we might have been related to the apes, there was a great interest in whether that was the case or not. And as I say, finding differences between human beings and apes was one of the pursuits that individuals undertook at this time. The distinguishing features, for example, Comper takes the Zwischenkiefer. Richard Owen, whom Nicholas has written about, thinks it has to do with the hippocampus, that human beings have a hippocampus, but apes do not. There was also the slave trade, and virtually all individuals writing from about in the 1770s right through the early part of the 19th century mention the slave trade as being a significant feature of their interest in human differences. They were also interested in measuring skulls, and why would that be the case? Skin color was an obvious distinguishing difference among groups of people, but skulls can be precisely measured, and they have that kind of mathematical, metrical characteristic that later on, well, Kant thought that anything that was going to be a Wissenschaft had to be mathematically tractable. That is, you have to apply mathematics. This is one of those efforts, I believe, to actually formulate what we take to be natural history, biology, in something like mathematical terms. So there was some considerable interest in the measurement of skulls. But here's the question that I want to pose in this very rapid analysis of 4 different individuals who attempted to scale human beings. Why did some naturalists at the turn of the 19th century believe that racial differences were permanent and hierarchical, and others thought them not natural differences or differences that were fairly inconsequential, and that all human beings had roughly the same talents on average? The Kant and Carus think that racial differences are deep and permanent, and their traits of the different groups of mankind can be organized in a hierarchy, whereas Blumenbach and Tiedemann think just the reverse. The individual who, as it were, established the first categories of racial or varietal difference was Linnaeus in his System de Nature of 1758 in the 10th edition. Human beings were members of the order of primates, the family of Anthropomorpha. The genus in which they fell was that of Homo. There were 2 species of the Homo genus, Homo sapiens and Homo troglodytes, are ape relatives. And the Homo sapiens were divided into 4 varieties, as you see indicated here. What I found interesting about this cataloging of human varieties by Linnaeus is he also includes the typical Hippocratic attitudes and Hippocratic temperaments of the various races. He divides them up. Of course, the American Indians are choleric or bilious, the Asiatics melancholy, the Africans phlegmatic, and the Europeans sanguine. Why he distributed the humors in this fashion it seems to me, a bit of a mystery. An individual who accepted the categories that Linnaeus had laid out was Immanuel Kant. Kant accepted Blumenbach's criterion that the signal or the indication of unity of a species was produced by the fertility of hybrids, hybrid offspring. So if the various races of mankind could interbreed, that indicated they were all of one species. And on that score, of course, the races had to be understood as varieties of a common species. Kant explicitly introduced a developmental idea into this analysis, namely there was an original species, whence the varieties were produced by a kind of degeneratio, Buffon's term, but that doesn't mean anything pejorative. That just indicates a stemming off from some entity. The races were divided, as you see, and he too employed the Hippocratic temperaments to depict the various races. What I find interesting, though, he changed the analysis slightly. So the Erste Rasse, the Northern Europeans, were wet and cold. You have to remember Kant was from Königsberg. And that is an indication, wet and cold is the melancholic humor, so that the Northern Europeans tended to be melancholic in their attitudes, and that seems to strike me as being perfect for Kant himself. Kant had a view about how to explain different racial degenerative products. How did one get the four varieties of human beings? He thought that environment was the main factor, but there were also what we would take to be hereditary factors. Human beings came with Keime and Anlagen. Keime, as Jack Semito helped me understand in Kant's terminology and what they meant for Kant. The Keime we're going to explain through the interactions with the environment, the parts that are exhibited by human beings, and the Anlagen determine mostly size. But these were features of the hereditary makeup of human beings that once an individual group of human beings was in a particular environment for some length of time, unspecified, the Anlage and Keime become, as it were, solidified. They don't change any longer. And so the racial differences expressed by the various groups of human beings are permanent. So one can move, the different groups can move into different environments. But this is not going to change things at all. A reader of Kant was Blumenbach, and Kant also read Blumenbach himself. They had a correspondence. They seduced one another into thinking that they came to an agreement about certain features, particularly the Bildungstrieb. This is an idea that Blumenbach has in order to, as I'll indicate in a moment, he came to this view that there is a power that is comparable to Newtonian gravity, which allowed Blumenbach to think of natural history as approaching something like a Newtonian science. In any case, Kant liked the idea when he understood what Herder, his former student, was doing in his developmental analysis of humanity. He excoriated his former student, and they had a great conflict. But when he saw virtually the same idea in Blumenbach, he approved of it, and he adopted this notion of the Bildungstrieb as part of his own repertoire in order to explain certain phenomena in natural history. I think almost all are familiar with the trajectory of Blumenbach's development as indicated by his major publications, so the inaugural dissertation, 1775. At this point, he is an embryological evolutionist, and evolution applied in embryology simply meant preformationism. The embryo began as a kind of miniature adult, and the process of evolutio occurred, the unrolling of that already pre-established figure, simply unrolled, as it were. The embryo was preformed. The traits that human beings exhibited were all due to climate. He didn't think that man had a Zwischenkiefer, and that he and Goethe had some correspondence over that later on. Blumenbach believed, as I think has already been indicated, that the traits of the various varieties of humankind, and here you see them indicated initially, the first four varieties, these are the Linnaean designations, that those traits were quite variable, and that the various groups, as it were, coincided so that one could go in skin color from very pale Northern Europeans through Southern Europeans to darker skinned people and vice versa. And he also thought that those racial traits were quite malleable, so that an individual put in a different environment, let's say a Negro brought to Europe, after many generations, skin color would gradually change. One of the, as you know, he added a fifth classification or a fifth variety of human beings, the Malay. Why he came to enlarge the group, the varietal group, it seems to me there are probably reasons having to do with his awareness of the results of Captain Cook's voyages, perhaps through his association with Georg Forster. That might be one of them. In 1781, he did some investigation of a freshwater polyp, or hydra, and was interested in the fact that hydra limbs, if you cut them off, will regenerate, and you can in fact cut the hydra in half, and it will generate the other two halves. He came to the conclusion that there must be some kind of power, extrinsic power, a Bildungstrieb as he calls it, which was, as I mentioned, comparable to Newton's law of gravity, which allowed him to promulgate certain laws of natural history. For example, that organisms lower in the scale will have greater reproductive capacity as opposed to organisms higher in the scale of development. These are, of course, the famous Blumenbach skulls. There are two sort of puzzling features about Blumenbach's representation of the various groups of human beings, one that we've already touched on, which is why are these skulls representative of the various human groups? And I think this becomes even more puzzling when you recognize that Blumenbach thought that traits were quite variable within the various human groups. They could change very easily. For example, the Georgian female, he was particularly enamored of because of the great symmetry of that skull. But he also notes that not all Europeans have that kind of symmetry. In fact, when he talks about German skulls in particular, he notes that young infants have very malleable skulls. You can take their skulls and reform them. And that was his explanation for the fact that Germans, at least of his acquaintance, tended to be, if you'll excuse the expression, block-headed. That is, German mothers, as he explained it, kept their infants on their backs, and therefore the back of their head was always lying on a flat surface, and therefore it flattened out the back of the skull. So with this kind of variability, why was the Georgian female representative of this particular group? So that's, as I say, one of the puzzles. He was, I just threw this in because Thomas Juncker is going to give a talk here as well. And Thomas recognized that when Steve Gould represented the Blumenbach arrangement, he put it slightly differently, making Blumenbach much more hierarchical than Blumenbach really was. When Gould tried to explain why that was the case, the explanation was completely unbelievable. My suspicion is that he thought this really did represent the point that he wanted to make, that even despite his modern sort of attitudes, that nonetheless he kept those racial hierarchical differences in some way. Blumenbach was quite interested in the intellectual capacities of Negroes, so that he talks about the variability of Negro color, and in fact, the groups of a group of Negroes will individually within the group have as much variability of skin color as the group of Negroes compared to other groups. He thought that blacks had the same mental dispositions as others of the human groups. There was really no significant difference. The only significant difference might be lack of education. He offered exemplary lives. Jacques Capitan, a freed black slave, got an education in Holland. He became a theologian, a Latinist, a poet, and he was always held up as indicating the natural possibilities of the black race. Friedrich Tiedemann, so the third in my repertoire of naturalists, supported quite strongly Blumenbach's disposition. Tiedemann was a man incensed by slavery, and he, prior to Morton, set out to measure human skulls. He produced the way in which he measured them. He would take a human skull, weigh it, then fill it full of millet seeds, weigh it again, and the difference indicated volumetric differences of the skull. And in so doing, he did not find significant differences among the four classes of human beings, that they all had approximately the same volume character of their skulls. What's interesting is he published this work in the Transactions of the Royal Society, initially in English, because at the time, slavery was being debated, and there were several slavery bills before Parliament, but he hoped that this was going to have an influence on the debate of those bills. He thought, as I mentioned, that Negroes were no different, essentially, than other groups of mankind. The judgments of Negro inferiority had to do with simply lack of education, lack of opportunity, and the degrading character of slavery itself. And he mentioned several of Blumenbach's representatives. Here's the table of his calculations of the skull capacities, first of the Caucasian group. And you can see that they vary from a Russian Cossack who was fairly big-headed. His skull had held 57 ounces worth of millet seed, all the way down to a Prussian who was rather small-headed at 32 ounces. And looking at the different groups, subgroups of blacks, he found the same sort of range. And he concluded, on the basis of a huge analysis of skulls, he did about 430 skulls providing these kinds of measurements. And when he published his results in German a year later, the way he analyzed it was, if you take the range of 42 ounces and 32 ounces, that range, he found that most of the various races fell within that range. And that's what led him to conclude that, on average, there was no significant differences among the races. Now, I have to say that Carus looked over those figures, and on the basis of Tiedemann's own figures, disputed them. He pointed out that if you just look at the number of skulls that are 40 ounces or above, almost half the Caucasian skulls are that way, whereas if you look at the black skulls, about 9% are that way. Carus is, at least for me, one of the more fascinating of this group, in fact, the most fascinating. He was a multi-talented man. He was educated as a physician and anatomist. During the Napoleonic Wars, he served to take care of the wounded, and particularly at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, which was the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, when something like 600,000 combatants met on the fields outside of Leipzig and suffered something like 90,000 casualties. Carus was in charge of the field hospitals, and he ministered to them. Carus was also a painter, and just last year in Dresden there was an exhibition of his works, a retrospective exhibition. A romantic painter. He was a friend of Caspar David Friedrich, and you'll note a similarity in the styles of the two. He too analyzed the races of mankind. He was interested in this, the distinctions among them. He had rather more colorful names than Erste Klasse, Zweite Klasse, and so forth. The people of the day, the Caucasians, the people of the night, the Negroes, the people of the Eastern Twilight, the Malayas, and the people of the Western Twilight, the American Indians. He thought that environmental differences were the ones that produced these racial types, and he too thought those types became permanent. And here is his analysis, or the beginning of his analysis of the measurement of skulls. He thought stuffing skulls with seeds was rather crude and really didn't give you measurements that were indicative of talents, because there could be some skulls that had more volume in less important parts of the skull, and therefore you would be misled by having a skull that presumably was larger but not terribly significant. So he developed his own mode of measurement, and I'll show you that here. First of all, he was a developmentalist, and all of these individuals, in some sense or another, from Kant through Carus, have a developmental perspective. Carus, however, believed that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that the embryo of more advanced creatures, for example, human beings, goes through the same stages in embryological development that the antecedent organisms went through in their own developmental phases. So you see initially in figure 1 over here, the head of the brain of a fish having 3 parts to it. Next, the brain of a lizard, then the brain of a sheep. They all have the same morphological structure, which is similar to the structure of the infant human being. So he was a recapitulationist, and this becomes part of his rather complex analysis of skull differences. He was also one who supported Goethe's view and Oken's view that of the vertebral theory of the skull, namely the belief that the skull of vertebrates is really 3 transformed vertebrae, just as Goethe held that a plant, the different parts of a plant, were really transformed organs of the ideal leaf, that all the parts of the plant, the flowering part, the stem, and the leaves, are all transformations of one underlying structure. So this was the case with Carus as well, and you can see the 3 plates that represent those 3 plates of the cranium and the remaining 3 plates of the skull face. So let me just point out that he measures these in 3 different ways. He has representative skulls, Schiller's skull being up at top, a Congo Negro right underneath. There is a Turkish thief represented up in the far right, and then a skull from an old Danish grave. He gives the calculations of these skulls, and here's, I've just pulled out one. Schiller, a Negro, and Napoleon. As it turns out, he thinks Schiller's numbers are elegant, graceful, harmonic. Napoleon's numbers are larger, but not as graceful and is not as harmonic as those of Schiller, and the Negroes are smaller and not harmonic at all. What one has to say about Tiedemann is that he actually didn't measure skulls. He measured casts of skulls, and he only measured a few of them. So he has a very small selection of skulls, and mostly he's interested in the skulls of people like Talleyrand, Napoleon, Schiller, Goethe, and he measures the casts of skulls, as I indicate. So he believed that racial differences were permanent. Skull proportions, however, indicated important differences. Women have smaller skulls than men, and they have a different proportion of the 3 plates of the skull, indicating that they are much more affected by emotions, as opposed to men whose the front of the skull is much larger proportionally in men. So here are the general conclusions, and which leaves me with a puzzle. If you look at the 4 theorists, they are all think that skulls are revelatory of distinctions among human beings, or perhaps not. All humans are of one species. They all agree about that. They undergo a developmental process to produce races, so they're all developmentalists of one sort or another. They all believe the environment is a crucial feature in producing the differences that are seen among mankind. They all recognize variability, but there are significant differences. Two, Kant and Carus think that racial characteristics are permanent. Tiedemann and Blumenbach think that, and they're hierarchical, and Tiedemann and Blumenbach think that racial characteristics are very fluid, they change, and they're not permanent. How to explain these differences? So I have a hypothesis that I'll just put out to you. The hypothesis is this. Blumenbach and Tiedemann are extraordinarily empirical. They look at a lot of skulls. They look at a lot of variability. Kant looked at no skulls, and Carus looked at very few, and they weren't really skulls. They were, in fact, casts of skulls. They were much more invested in a theoretical point of view than Blumenbach, I think, or Tiedemann. So there's probably a lesson here, but I'll let you draw the lesson. Thank you.